Hi, it's October 9th, 2019. This is the first of three videos. I've decided that what I'm going to do is 3, 7, 8-minute videos. The first one will be on the Anti-Federalist critique of the proposed Constitution. The second one will review in some detail Madison's argument in Federalist number 10. And the third one will be the same sort of textual analysis of Federalist number 51. So this first video is by way of review. It's important to kind of set the table with what the critics of the proposed Constitution said about it as it came out of the convention. Convention wrapped up its work in September 1787. Congress transmitted the document to the states. The states in their legislatures went along with the proposal to have ratification conventions in each state where the new proposal would be debated and voted on. And the critics, the people who opposed the Constitution, I'm sorry, I'm going to be looking at my notes here a little bit. The people who opposed the Constitution got pinned with the label Anti-federalist. They didn't call themselves Anti-federalists. It's what got imposed on them. The proponents of the new Constitution, the leaders who wanted this new frame of government enacted and established, took on the name Federalists. Another word for that might be nationalist. Federalist represented the people who favored more power to the whole federation, hence Federalists. And the Anti-Federalists got pinned with being against it. In politics, it's often better to be for something as well as against something. And the Federalists were generally, more elites. They were more elitist. They were the better off people, the people who owned more property, the people who had been leaders. Not uniformly, but as a general matter, they had more wealth and power than their opponents. So in this video, what we want to do is talk about what these two groups had in common, and then specifically about the criticisms that the Anti-Federalists leveled against the proposed Constitution. We tend to overlook what they shared. They did share a modern idea that the purpose of government was to protect liberty. So they had that in common. What are they disagreeing about? They're disagreeing about the proper frame of government that can best secure people's liberty. So obviously the Anti-Federalists want to keep the Articles of Confederation. They might want to tinker with them in some cases, but they don't want this new Constitution because it's not the right owner's manual to protect your liberty. So I think maybe we could say they had a little bit of a different accent, political accent about freedom and what freedom means. Your textbook talks about positive and negative liberty. The Anti-Federalists were more interested in localism, civic participation, the importance of, say, community or religion in politics compared to the Federalists. But basically the purpose of government is that which we find in the Declaration, to protect your liberty and freedom and your basic human rights. So I'm going to have a list of 5 or 6 things, let's say six points they made that we've gone over in class, but by way of review, the first thing the Anti-Federalists said in objection to the new Constitution was that the convention wasn't authorized to propose a new frame of government. And that's true. The Congress under the Articles authorized a convention to revise the Articles of Confederation. And we know, this is interesting, the convention met in secret, and there were no leaks, no leakers. Nobody knew what the debates were there until a long time after it ended. We really don't learn the details of the Constitutional Convention until 1840, 4 years after Madison's death in 1836. Madison kept detailed and copious notes on what happened. He revised them. He revised those notes shortly before 1800, so we can't even be sure that his notes actually reflect what happened there. But they objected to the legitimacy of the proceedings and what that convention did, and they made 3 points about the legality of it. Right? We have a Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, and it says you need all 13 states to agree to any amendment to that document. The framers said that 9 states would be sufficient, not 13. If any 9 states agreed with the new Constitution, it would become the Constitution for those states. More importantly, and actually prior to that point, the Anti-Federalists said, you weren't authorized to do this. Congress said, go revise the Articles, and you did a new frame of government. So you didn't even follow the orders of the legitimate government under the Articles. The Articles of Confederation said that when states said yes or no to amendments, the state legislative body would do that. The Constitution, the proposed Constitution, in Article 7, said there will be conventions in the states. Conventions are people called together just for that occasion, for that question. They're not elected officials who serve in the legislative body. They're special conventions. And that also violated the sort of rules of the game. Madison had an answer to this. If you wanted to see his answer, you read Federalist Paper number 40. He made a kind of the ends justify the means argument. He said, you told us to go think about what an adequate government would be, given our many troubles. And we couldn't revise the Articles and have an adequate government, so we decided to come up with a framework of government that would be adequate, and the people can then decide from there. Okay, so turning to this list of points the Anti-Federalists made against the new Constitution, the first objection is very important, and it's very important to contrast this with Madison's conception, and that has to do with representation. We've talked about this. What does it mean to be represented? For the Anti-Federalists, the ideal is that you are there yourself, representing yourself. That's impossible. You can't represent yourself in the government, but any system of representation should be judged against that ideal standard. Right? How close does it come to having a representative body be an exact portrait or mirror of the people? Right? So a representative body should be as close to the people socially, geographically, in terms of accountability, electoral accountability especially. So what do I mean by socially? Well, a farmer should represent a farmer. A mechanic should be represented by a mechanic. A merchant should be represented by a merchant. You should have representation for who you are particularly. Geographically, the legislative body shouldn't be far away. It should be nearby so you can see it and keep an eye on it. In terms of accountability, well, how often do you get to say yes or no to someone you've elected? The Anti-Federalists had a saying, where annual elections end, tyranny begins. We should be able to say yes or no every year to every elected official. That was something that many of them endorsed, frequent elections. So here representation is as close as we can come to the people themselves, understanding that obviously, most people won't be involved in day-to-day government. Madison's idea is much different, right? Madison's idea of representation is represented by the image of a filter. That an elaborate system of representation filters and refines the public view, and most people, most of the time, won't be involved in day-to-day governance. There will be a better off, a more well-known, perhaps more virtuous elite that will be chosen to do the work of government day-to-day. Second point, and here's where Madison is really radical, is really sort of innovating in political theory. The common understanding of Republican government, a government that was in some sense accountable to, controlled by the people, popular sovereignty, separation of powers, the rule of law, elections. These are the building blocks of any conception of a Republican government, and that's what they fought the revolution for. But the understanding to this point in time was that republics had to be small. And they had to be small geographically so that you could have an assurance that all of the people engaging in self-governance were more or less alike. They shared religious views. They weren't wild class differences. Um, and if they were homogeneous in terms of their values and beliefs, then self-government could work. In a large territory, you'd get a lot of different kinds of people, cultures, religions, economic groups, and it would be fractious. It would be internally divided. So you want to pay careful attention to this when we get to Federalist 10. This is a sort of a the common wisdom had it that this is a defect. You can't have a Republican government in a large territory. And I'll tell you why the Anti-Federalists said that right now. But Madison turns that into a great virtue. That a Republican form of government is much, much more likely to survive and be stable and to be well functioning over what he calls an extended republic. So why did the Anti-Federalists object to extending the sphere of government over this vast region, covering over 1,000 miles top to bottom and 800 miles to the Mississippi? Well, again, large republics are internally fractious, and there's going to be a lot of conflict. People aren't going to agree on what to do, so how are they going to govern themselves? Two, even if they're not internally fractious, large republics tend to be economically prosperous. They tend to develop a military apparatus because economic prosperity brings foreign entanglements and foreign conflicts. So large republics can tend to be militaristic. You're going to end up with a permanent military establishment, and of course, we wouldn't want that. And the third point about a large republic that they made goes something like this: even if not internally fractious, and even if not externally militaristic, a large republic cannot possibly foster enough of a sense of civic virtue, enough of a sense of commonality and common purpose to sustain a republic. A republic depends on people being actively engaged in the business of self-government, in knowing what's going on, in participating, in taking turns in terms of ruling and being ruled. And if you had a large republic, the vast majority of the people would just be passive, inert, concerned with their private lives, would not be involved. And this would be a recipe for disaster, because you'd end up with a system that was really designed just for people to pursue their own self-interests all the time. And you would not have a Republican government. Okay, so I'll just go through. I'm coming up on 13 minutes here. I promised to be shorter. Let me just go through the rest of their criticisms a little more quickly. I think the ones I've talked about so far are the most important points of contrast with the Madisonian argument. The Anti-Federalists looked at the new Constitution, and they were worried about the separation of powers, in the sense that too few people had too much power. They were really concerned about the blending of power, and particularly with respect to the Senate and the President. These were elites that were selected in very indirect ways when they were elected. And they had a lot of power, and the Senate did a lot of things that the House wasn't involved in, like signing off on treaties or approving presidential nominations. So they saw potential for corruption there, especially if you think about the size of the Senate at the time and the powers of the president. They worried that the powers were too much blended, and that the blending of powers was the answer for fearing power, but all of this was too removed from ordinary people. They looked at the Constitution and its vague language and the vagueness of Article 3, which sets up the Supreme Court and the judiciary, and they worried that the court would read the Constitution so as to aggrandize national power. That is, by the way, their overarching concern. Through all of these points, it's that there's too much power at the level of the national government, and that consolidation and centralization of power is a dangerous thing. And they looked at the courts as a potential engine of that. And they were correct. The Supreme Court did play that role over the next 40 or 50 years under Chief Justice John Marshall. Not to the extent that they feared, but certainly the courts were a nationalizing agency of the government, and they did that by overturning state laws that were said to violate the Constitution of the United States. Finally, and this is a big point where the Anti-Federalists are entitled to be included in the framers of the government. As you know, the original Constitution did not include a Bill of Rights, and the Anti-Federalists argued for one in the ratification debates, particularly in Massachusetts, and the votes were so close in Massachusetts and Virginia and New York that it became part of the bargain. That okay, we the Federalists agree that the first thing we'll do under a new government is compose and try to enact a Bill of Rights, and that's what came to pass. So we credit the Anti-Federalists' fear about central government and the idea that you could write down on paper certain rights that the national government had to respect, and that would help preserve freedom from this centralized power. So that did come to pass. It was extremely close. The Constitution was ratified by 10 votes in Virginia and only 3 votes in New York. If you don't have Virginia and you don't have New York, you don't really have this new government. Another point about the Anti-Federalists that wasn't explicit in their arguments, but they were pointing something out that did have to be corrected. The framers didn't anticipate that there would be organized parties, political parties. They knew there would be partisan behavior. They feared majority faction. The Federalists did more than anything else. And a political party is just a softer term for faction. But the Anti-Federalists were pointing out that there wasn't much to connect ordinary people to the national government. Like there weren't any organizations or structures that would make things coherent and intelligible. And within 40 or 50 years, it's not only that there will be partisan behavior, there will even be parties, but the argument becomes that parties are not a necessary evil, but rather a good thing because they organize some semblance of democratic participation. Right, so we can credit the Anti-Federalists with pointing out some problems with the Constitution that recur throughout our history. That the objection from participatory democracy, the objection that this is a kind of republicanism that isn't terribly democratic, that's still with us. Right, so I'm going to end here. It's a lot longer than I promised. I'm sorry. And we'll turn to Madison and Hamilton's response to this. The papers we're reading right now are 10 and 51, both authored by the genius who was behind the constitutional framework, James Madison. Okay, stopping here.